Good morning. My name is Chris Wright, and I am a PhD candidate and graduate research and teaching associate in the urban education program here at the University of Pittsburgh School of Education. Um, I want to first thank the Center for Urban Education team for their collective efforts and labor in making another CUESEF possible. I also want to thank the Practices of Freedom Grant for co-sponsoring this panel discussion. And last but certainly not least, I want to extend a sincere thank you to our four panelists for taking time to join us and whose experiences and knowledges will guide us in what is sure to be a robust discussion on the university, student organizing, and a long struggle for a free Palestine and the liberation of oppressed peoples globally. Before we get into the discussion, I have the distinct honor of introducing our four panelists. Elyanna Sharbaji is a Syrian-American and recent graduate of psychology and political science at the University of Pittsburgh. Jean McAdoo is a doctoral student in the Urban Schooling Division at the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. His research interests are positioned at the intersections of Black studies and education and are primarily concerned with conceptualizing, developing, and implementing more liberatory models of education for Black students. His work explores the utility of counter-hegemonic all-Black educational spaces in cultivating Black students' liberatory consciousness. He is also an abolitionist whose research and praxis are guided by the imperative of abolishing all forms of carcerality and the belief that another world is possible. In April of this year, Gene donated his labor to supporting the UCLA encampment and helped defend it from white supremacist attackers on the night of April 30th, and has since been on strike as a member of the UAW 4811. Michaela Tyus is a community organizer and graduate student at UCLA. Born and raised in the Inland Empire region of California, Michaela has been active in local community organizing efforts for the past 5 years. In 2020, she co-founded a grassroots abolitionist mutual aid organization, Feed the Block IE, that seeks to build power with and meet the basic needs of marginalized community members through resource distributions and political education programs. Michaela also organizes with Community Movement Builders LA, a nationwide Black-led org that looks to create self-determined communities through organizing. At UCLA, she is a second-year master's student in the Department of African American Studies, researching the Black and Latinx resistance efforts in the 2020 uprisings in the Inland Empire, and how these efforts create an archive of resistance that can inform and inspire liberatory futures. This past April, Michaela joined UCLA's SJP's encampment and helped organize logistical and strategic aspects of the efforts, specifically the food and kitchen tent. Since the initial encampment, Michaela has been active in the UAW 4811 graduate student worker strike. And finally, Sam Weiner is a recent graduate of the School of Education Master's in Teaching program here at the University of Pittsburgh. They completed student teaching and substituted in Pittsburgh Public Schools. His main research focuses on liberation-focused critical studies, anti-Blackness in education, and political education, miseducation as a form of colonial warfare. He has been organizing around Palestinian liberation since Al-Qasr flood started, both as a student and a new educator. I am extremely excited to be in conversation with the four of you. And again, I want to thank the four of you for joining in this conversation. I wanted to open with a more general question about how it is you all get into this work. So if you could, let us know if you have a long history in this work, what moment in your life and or your student experience actually worked to radicalize you into action. Um, and whoever would like to take it up first, feel free to jump in.
I can start. Good morning, everybody. Thankful for being here. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Dr. Thank you, Dr. Dancy, for the invitation. Anybody else who was involved in the decision making, much appreciated. Yeah, so for me, I've been at UCLA for about 7 years, right? I went to UCLA for undergrad, so I've been here for 7 years straight. And I bring that up to say that I guess my sort of activism, I guess you could call it, was really rooted in trying to serve and uplift the Black community. So I was a student leader in the Black community for, a few years, did a lot of mentorship for high school students, helping high school students, try to get into schools like UCLA and whatnot. But that, that I think that was just sort of like passion work, things that kept me going as an undergrad. I wouldn't say I got involved in organizing until around 2020, which I'm sure is, the case for a lot of people, right? The sort of George Floyd moment that we call it, the George Floyd uprisings. Um, it felt like everybody was mobilized into action. And so I found my, sort of place in the movement with Cops Off Campus and No UCPD. When I was a senior when all that was going down. So doing a lot of, we paired up with some fellow undergrads, some folks who were involved in the undergrad student council, the Million Dollar Hoods project at UCLA, and kind of formed a research team, put together a lot of data on UCPD. Found things like, Black students are like 19 times more likely to be stopped by UCPD in Westwood. So different things like that, kind of, uplifting the sort of necessity for, you know, uh, transforming public safety at the university is kind of where my sort of activism or organizing roots are at. And then, during the last strike, just I would say did some counter organizing against union leadership. We felt like wasn't doing the best that they could to represent us in our interests at the bargaining table. So did some organizing around that, sort of fight against counterinsurgency, and of course, most recently with the encampment that went up at UCLA. Um, I think after the encampment went up at Columbia, it was kind of like, more a matter of when and not if an encampment will go up at UCLA, right? Given the long history that and legacy that UCLA has regarding student activism and encampments in particulars or tent cities, which we saw with the anti-apartheid movement in the 80s. So it was just a matter of when, and when that happened, I popped up and pulled up and did what whatever I could to support the encampment. I was following the lead of Michaela a lot, who I'll let her say what she did, but yeah, so just mobilized by action, and I think the common thread is wanting to push the university to be a more liberatory place. So yeah.
Thank you for that. Hey, Michaela, you wanna go next?
Sure, I'll go next. Good morning, everybody. Thank you for having me and for the invite as well. And thank you, Jean, for kind of being like the liaison and inviting me. I would say for myself, I kind of always have been in activism since I've been a student. I went into undergrad in 2016 in San Diego, and kind of every single year that I was in school, or just like the years that I was put into school or graduating, there was like a large political moment. 2016 was when Trump was elected, as we all know. And just being in San Diego, being so close to the border and his attacks on the border kind of just like threw me into that, into doing different types of stuff on my campus. I would say also 2020 was a big moment for me. All throughout my undergrad, I was really involved in like the ethnic studies department. That was my major. So I was always thinking about race, ethnicity, culture, power, all these different things that we see out in play. And so in 2020, because of COVID, I had moved back from San Diego to my hometown, which is like a predominantly Black and brown working class region. And just seeing all the need that the folks just in my area, my neighbors were needing. Our houses population grew like immensely, and just seeing the lack of resources that the state was providing but also the lack of resources or kind of like the ways that the nonprofits were also not meeting the needs of these people in a specific way, kind of pushed me into action, into creating the mutual aid org that I did. But also in 2020, I was, out in the streets, as we like to say. I was, really, really heavily involved. And that kind of was like the moment that I realized that I wanted to dedicate my life to this effort and to doing this work. And so I've kind of just been in the movement ever since really 2020, but even before then, like I said, in 2021, I was actually a community organizer, the criminal justice and youth organizer for a Black-led nonprofit in my region. Was also doing work with my mutual aid, like I said. And then when I decided to go back to grad school, I kind of was like, had this idea of the radicalization that I had was really from political education with my community that I was doing. So I would say that kind of like my studies in undergrad really prepared me for, or it kind of set the foundation for what the community work I was doing. But also I would say my radical like political consciousness development really came from actually being in the streets and from actually learning and studying in a non-academic way, or not in a non-academic way, but outside of the university. And so when I decided to go back into the university, I kind of went back with the purpose of stealing, going in there to take resources, to take information and all of that, and just really bring it back to the community and to people that don't have access to that. And so ever since I have been at UCLA, like I said, I'm going into my second year. That's kind of really been my focus, is how do I take these resources? How do I steal, as Fred Moten likes to say, take it from that, from UCLA and then bring it back to my community, and how do I integrate it into the work that I'm doing? So yeah, that's pretty much been my journey. And then I saw the encampment, or I actually heard about the encampment, or plans of the encampment, and I just got really involved in that as well. So yeah, that's been my journey so far.
Thank you so much for that context. And I love the attention to study. I got a question I want to ask about that a bit later. Elyanna or Sam, who would like to go next?
I can go next. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me here to speak. I really appreciate it. I guess my journey into student organizing has mostly started this year, but as a Syrian, I was born and raised in Syria. I have experienced, the war, or like the revolution, and then that resulted in a war after. And that's part of like what kind of got me involved more in activism and organizing. That was back in 2011, and then I was too young back then, but I knew like this is what my passion is. I wanted to go into more like activism, organizing, and but I was still in high school, so I didn't really do much, and especially, moving into a new country, not knowing anything about this until, so I was mostly focused on Syria up until 2020, learning about the community here, what's happening also in America, because, from an outsider perspective, I didn't know anything about what's happening here and like how similar, the struggle and oppression between the indigenous and the Black community in the US and like the region in the Middle East as well. And up until last year, I was involved more with MINASA, the Middle Eastern Student Association on campus. And I've done organizing with the Iranian community for Women Life Freedom movement that started last year in Iran. And that was mostly, just protests, stuff like that. It wasn't really much up like actions like what we're doing now. So after October 7th, I met a few people. We started organizing more. And I guess how we got here, to the encampment, we were looking at the history of Pittsburgh, University of Pittsburgh, mostly about organizing, student activism. And I was, I guess fascinated by the
Elyanna, you still with us? Think they be having some connection issues. Sam, I'm going to transition to you and let you answer the question. And if Elyanna comes back, or when Elyanna comes back, we'll let her finish up with how she came into this work.
No, yeah. Mine's really basic. Like everybody else said, the 2020 George Floyd Intifada was really like the major political awakening. Like my background is very like middle upper class white suburb that was like originally a red line, like green line zone right next to a red line zone that was for the so-called domestic workers that like the archives call them. Um and like private schools, country clubs kind of environment. I went to like public schools, but still, so like it wasn't until I moved out of that and into, the university life in the middle of Pittsburgh and started getting to do, research and classes on the history of Pittsburgh, industrial, post-industrial cities, and the moves that were made there for gentrification and displacement. Um, and started like kind of taking just political education style courses that has been mentioned. And that's where I really want to thank Chris and Dr. Dancy and Dr. Martez Files and Stacy and everyone else from Q, because those are the classes that I did take that got me where I am today. So like not only thank you for bringing me in here, but those classes were super important. Oh, Elyanna's back.
the temperature is so high. So I locked my phone.
Yes.
Oh, sorry. What I was saying is, sorry, did you want to talk first, Sam, or?
He just went.
Okay. It, I was saying that, I was fascinated by the movement that happened back in 1986, I think, where the anti-apartheid in South Africa. And we were looking into, I guess, the encampment that happened back then. Well, yeah. And starting with Colombia now, students, we knew that this is going to happen soon. And it was just a matter of like who and when, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you for that context. And Sam, before I transition into a specific question about the encampments, was there anything else that you wanted to let us know?
I think really just that like when it comes to Palestine, that organizing really only started once Al-Aqsa flood began on October 7th in high gear. And like Elyanna said, and Jean before, it was just a matter of when, not like if. And what it was going to look like. So like Pittsburgh, it's been different than like UCLA or Columbia because of the size of the student body, the militarization of the police response, and what our student body is willing to do compared to others. So that's all been like an interesting thing to think about recently.
Absolutely. And I want that actually to be something that surfaces in this conversation. The differences between the encampments, the differences between how the university mobilized, the state mobilized university police. So I'm hoping we uncover that a bit in this conversation as well. I want to transition into a question specifically about the encampments, right? Um, and I want to think about what it is students are asking for, right? Divestment. Um, and I want to think about how do we understand the communication between student organizers and university administration specifically. On the one hand, there's been a slew of public statements that are about students and released to the public in ways that criminalize and demonize them. Here, I'm thinking specifically about the University of Texas, for instance, Columbia, Emory, as well as UCLA and our chancellor here at the University of Pittsburgh. Um, there have also been more private meetings with students, organizers, and university administration, which in our case here at Pitt hasn't really gone anywhere, and has been more about disciplining students into using the proper mechanisms for change. And then there's this weird case where administration doesn't talk to students at all, which I know we've experienced in multiple ways here at Pitt. Um, so I'm wanting to get an understanding or get you all's perspectives on what is being said by administration about students, what is being said directly to students. Is it in response to the demands that sort of necessitate the student encampments in the first place? Um, and I also want to think about how do we make sense of the refusal to meet with students or the refusal to answer basic questions about university investments in genocide. So I know that's kind of a long-winded question, so I'll kind of repeat the main points is how do we understand the communication between university administration and students? And then that is referring to what's being said about students to the public, what's being said directly to students, and how do we understand the sort of loud silence of avoiding conversation altogether? Does that make sense? And if anybody would like to open us up and engage in that question, whoever would like to go first, feel free.
I can start us off. Yeah, I think at UCLA, um, and like most other places, there's been this sort of refusal to meet in good faith, at least during the days of the encampment. Um, I think initially it wasn't even our chancellor, it wasn't Gene Block meeting with students. It was one of his vice chancellors, Darnell Hunt, who was a black man who wasn't communicating with students directly, but through faculty, right? Through a sort of like faculty liaison third party. And so that, already kind of indicates to some sort of, right, this lack of good faith, this lack of respect, I would say, for students and what students are asking for. And then I remember in the early days, through that channel, we found out that he offered a Palestinian Studies Research Center, right, which is something that students did not ask for at all. Right. And I bring that up to kind of indicate the ways that a lot of negotiating with administration is you're really just kind of engaging in like it not willingly, but counterinsurgency, right? This sort of like this, here, take this research center and hopefully that'll cool you guys off and hopefully you won't ask for too much more. Right. So there's total sort of lack of willingness to meet in good faith. And I mean, I think that was even further demonstrated by the fact that we asked him to publicly um sorry. We asked him to publicly come to the encampment to negotiate, right? And so he did, but this happened hours before there was a police raid, right? And so I think all of this sort of points to just this sort of lack of willingness to meet in good faith. And so I think it's necessary to sort of to understand that, like you said the word refusal. And I think you have to understand the refusal as really like an indictment of the university, right? The university is not interested by any means in the same sort of like social justice that we're all interested in, right? So and then when you understand that, plus the sort of power and the power of force that the university has, I think that has to really, really reframe how you think about what you're trying to do and where you're trying to win and how you're going to win. Because given all of these things perhaps a win is not going to come through the sort of legal policy official channels by themselves, right? So how do we build more power? And I think that's something that we've even seen with the strike as well, which hasn't been going too great, but yeah.
Kind of to I like how Gene mentioned that the university doesn't have the same idea of social justice as we do, and they never will. Uh, at least in the case of Pitt, with the university here, um, there has been that refusal of administration to talk to us. Like the chancellor is like never been seen on campus, like virtually ever, let alone coming to talk to us. But there's kind of two people I can think of in particular who have been more than willing to talk to us, like multiple times for like no nothing meetings. One is Panzella, I don't know exactly. I think she's like Dean of Student Affairs or something. And then the Vice Chancellor or Vice Provost of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, Clyde Pickett, uh, will never refuse a meeting and then will fact like offer you a bunch of meetings. And there's kind of been this move by the university here to offer relentless, like wasted meetings. They've offered the students asking for divestment here meetings with the chief investment officer, who can't make any decisions on divestment without the chancellor or board of trustees like demanding it and pushing for it. Yet we keep getting told to go to the guy who can't do anything. So like there's the refusal to speak to those in power, but there's also this like insidious movement within the university to pretend to be compliant with students, like pretending to give them, as Chris said, the proper channels, but like none of those proper channels will ever lead anywhere because otherwise they wouldn't be the proper channels for the university. The university, kind of like I think Michaela quoted the undercommons, like can't be a place of refuge while it is a place of enlightenment to a certain extent. Like it will support us in the way of like it gave us the education that brought us here to a certain extent. But the second you start to actually act on that education, it's going to clamp down on you as hard as it possibly can while keeping its kind of face of good faith. Like both Pitt and UCLA have continued to try this idea that they are still bastions of liberalism and, you know, free discourse, which has been ridiculous to kind of see while we know that administration doesn't want to talk to us and the university doesn't want to do anything.
I also wanted to touch base with what Sam said already. You know, many, like multiple administrations have reached out to us about meeting, which was usually Pickett and Benzella. And they usually, like, you know, we always go and talk with them. You know, we tell them our demands and we need to meet with the Chancellor, John Gable, because we understand that they don't have the power to do anything or, you know, to give us what our demand is. And we've, even before the encampment, we've met with them multiple times regarding whether it's this issue or different issues, but we know they don't have this power to like change it. I remember at the first encounter we've met with Benzella and Pickett, Clyde Pickett. And it was mostly about, when we went to the meeting, they wanted to talk about free speech and how we can, you know, safely, I guess, protest. And that's not what we want. Like we know we are protesting, we are non-violently protesting. We know our rights, we know what we should do. What we want from the administration is for them to hear what our demands is and respond with that, not to tell us how to protest and like what we need to do to be effectively protesting, I guess. The other thing is like about the statement, the public statement. I think many of these universities don't really care about, you know, the students. It's mostly what they care about is the public image of these institutions. So whenever, you know, they refer to us as violent protesters or agitators, or, you know, as like we're not students here, it's more just to say like, these are, you know, we're listening to the students, but these are not students, and they're not, you know, being nonviolent. Oh yeah, which is a false, you know, claim, because we've always protested state, you know, non-violently. We've always done everything. The, you know, if you see their responses, they're the one who are like using violence and like against the protesters. So yeah.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Michaela, did you have?
Yeah, I just wanted to definitely just touch upon what Elyanna was talking about and then give more context to like UCLA. And so I wanted to like touch upon the like aspect of like what admin is saying about students, kind of what like the idea. I think during the encampment, the first encampment that we've had three or three attempted ones. But the first one was, and the biggest, largest one, the rhetoric, like the emails that were being sent out from the chancellor's office were like very neutral. They were very like, students are protesting, rah, rah, rah. It's nonviolent so far, right? And then it kind of just started escalating. And the way that we were framed definitely started to shift as we were, you know, holding our ground. We were fighting Zionists every night. And so I think the opinion of us started to shift, and it was being sent from our chancellor as like a large email, mass email. And then recently, as we have kept escalating and kept coming back, there has been like a real shift in like the messaging around us. So now our chancellor, he just retired or stepped down. No, I think he retired. And so now we have this new appointed, Jean can correct me if I'm wrong, like police, the head of UCPD, or a whole different policing task force that's now sending emails that are explaining what's happening on campus. And the language has now shifted completely from neutral to completely like, these protesters are violent, they're harassing the cops, they're threatening the cops, they sent 3 cops to the hospital, which was, if you see any of the footage, it's just absolutely the most wrong like narrative ever. So we see the shift has been changing and escalating as violence has been escalating. And so the language about students, it's also, I think it's really embedded in just the background of UCLA and also where we're situated. Like we're situated in Westwood, which is a really large Jewish population, but specifically Zionists and really wealthy Zionists. So that influence is like really heavy throughout our campus. And so that's something that we're always combating, is this larger outside public kind of intimidation tactics and narrative that's really, honestly, that's a whole different battle. And so kind of having to navigate that, I think, is something that kind of separates us from other universities in the way that we're being attacked, not only by our university, but the narrative about us also is being like told by the houses that are surrounding the university. So we have people that are just coming on and just attacking students to this day. And so I just wanted to add that context too about how students are being the framework of students is really, really, really ugly, and it's just getting worse. So
Yes, I appreciate that so much, because it helps transition into my next question, but it also, I think, surfaced what I wanted to be surfaced in that question, which is the kind of rhetoric that university, particularly the administration, are crafting about their own students as violent, is working in multiple ways, right? So I'm thinking about Sam and I's meeting with the provost and we were framed as attackers because us and some other students across the School of Education released statements with demands. We wrote emails, and the provost himself sort of framed us as attacks, as unfair attackers, without actually paying attention to the content, right? And then there's this way in which, like Joan Gable releases this statement about students being violent, and everybody who's associated with Pitt are getting like the ESN emergency email, emergency text message, emergency phone call about a situation at the Cathedral of Learning. And this is the same line that, would contact us if there was like actual violence happening on campus, right? So there's a way in which students are being framed as violent, but I'm also thinking about what that does to sort of mobilize the state against students, right? And how the university is sort of brokering that and sort of actually forwarding a kind of Zionist repression. So that kind of leads me into my next question. I think this moment has surfaced some truths about the university that have long existed, but become painfully more obvious during this moment of accelerated genocide in Gaza. So I'm thinking particularly here about how everyone just kind of spoke to how the university sort of positions itself, how it's actually most interested in protecting its own interests, even if it means violating its own students, right? So I'm thinking here about specifically the language of diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice that exists throughout mission and vision statements, and yet the administration, on the one hand, can refuse to meet with students, but then can sort of galvanize and send police and military arms to violently arrest students who are calling for divestment. And so I'm wanting to know if you all can speak to this. There's a way in which the contradictions of the university have been raised in this moment. And so that's kind of the tension that I'm sitting in, right? Like the way in which the university describes itself, diverse, equitable, like you said, a sort of beacon of liberalism, which, has its own, is a loaded term in and of itself. But there's the way in which the university communicates itself to the public. And then there's a way in which we've been able to see the ways in which it engages peaceful student protesters. So I'm wanting to know if y'all could sort of situate us within those contradictions and we could speak to them. So yeah, if that makes sense, I'll open it up for you all.
I think just kind of my first thoughts on that. Pitt has had an interesting history when it comes to its use of the terms diversity, equity, inclusion, because especially within the last few years, our local chapter of like Turning Point USA and some other groups have invited like Michael Knowles, who once called for the eradication of transgenderism, as he said, a few rabid anti-abortionists, a few very pro racist, white supremacist speakers to come to campus, all under this kind of banner of free speech. And each one of those events has been kind of protested or picketed by students. And when students get to those protests, there's like a line of cops surrounding the building, like already there before students get there. Especially after the Michael Knowles incident, where police eventually arrested two of the people there, and like they're still under charges for a protest on the campus. And like mentioned earlier, it's because the university has been able to be this kind of interlocutor between the state's monopoly on violence and those supposedly protected by its campus. For a long time, the university has been this kind of encircled and privatized area where those within it are separate from those without it, and now have certain privileges and protections from the state, like around them. And all the state's rhetoric, the university's rhetoric to play us as outside agitators, which in the case of UCLA is ironic to me, seeing as those that attacked the encampment were the outside agitators, were funded by outside agitators. Yeah, and all that. And even here, like Pitt, like we get attacked by outside agitators, like some like really old middle-aged white Zionists coming out of like Squirrel Hill and Shadyside that are clearly not Pitt students coming to harass Pitt students. But when they do that rhetoric to play us as outside agitators, they are allowing the state now to come in and promote violence because these are not university students. They're not under the protection of the university anymore. And this is like happening at Pitt at a university where like we have not even done what has happened at other universities. Like we are not Cal Poly. We have not successfully taken over buildings and like barricaded them in. We're not like a few other schools like that. And I think part of it is the state and the university don't want another Kent State or Jackson State, which is like a worse version of Kent State for Black students. But they're finding that they can't allow things to continue as they are. So it's been very interesting to see the amount of force they'll bring. Pitt brought city, county, multiple university precincts, state troopers, different county sheriffs came. UCLA brought like at least 4 different police departments, I think, with like helicopters, SWAT, riot gear. Like they are bringing full militaries to students because they've played these rhetorical games with us. And that's why I think it's most important that when we promote our narratives, we're not winning the narrative battle in the mainstream media, and I don't think we will because we don't control it yet. We win the media narrative. We win the narrative on our side. We win it within our groups and spreading it our way. And part of that has to be we're done with this enclosure of the university. These university encampments, these university protests are not just for university students because we're not the only ones affected by the university. UCLA and Pitt have both dispossessed communities around them, displaced them, taken their homes and land. Like the university divesting from genocide would benefit everyone in the city, just like flat. It's everyone's in the city's problem. And these universities have made it everybody's problem. When you call in like LAPD or you call in, PPD, you've made it that city's taxpayers' problem. You've used all their resources, all their money. You can't play these. They're playing rhetorical games while clearly exposing themselves for what they are. And I think that's the biggest contradiction for the university now is that those contradictions are so visible to us. I think to like a lot of scholars and people that like have come to CUESEF before, like have understood this for a while, but now it is so clear that the rhetorical games they play, the narrative they make is contradictory to how they have to act to protect themselves or to keep themselves going. And I think it'll be interesting as we see students come back in the fall and start to reactivate, remobilize. And is the university going to play naive and as if nothing ever happened and like this is the first time they've seen it again? Or are we going to see locked down, militarized campuses that we haven't seen before? I think that's kind of like what I'm wondering for the fall.
Yeah, I think I want to echo what you were saying, Sam, kind of about like what you were saying about the narrative and kind of like the way that the university, the contradictions, right? That the militarization of the university kind of is uplifting and bringing to light. And I think DEI is has always been their answer, specifically after 2020. Like Jean said, our vice provost, whatever, is like a Black man. And he was the one that was sent to interact with us at the camp. And so I think DEI is just like a rose-colored tinted like fascism, right? And so I think UCLA also claims to be like one of the most diverse UC campuses, but the contradictions, right, are so like real and they're so highlighted, especially after the militarization. It's really disheartening and sad seeing interacting with undergrads, first-year undergrads that had such like high hopes and aspirations and they're first gen and they're here at UCLA and they're just getting attacked and brutalized for standing up. And they told me, like, like this is what they thought that they could do. This is what they thought universities would offer, and is a way for you to really take what you're learning and apply it. And so it's really disheartening to see. I think for myself, I was a little bit like, universities are universities. They're just large landlords, right? And businesses. But it's really disheartening to see this next generation or this younger generation literally have to physically be violently attacked, for them to kind of experience that. And so I think on the one hand, like the violence and everything, is like definitely showing the contradictions. But I also think it is a way, or it is something that just hearing the undergrads and feeling so inspired by them and the way that they are so politically developed and disciplined in a way that when I was their age, like I didn't understand it the way that they did. And so it really gives me hope to see like what is actually going to happen in the next few years. What is escalation going to look like? What is demonstrations going to look like? And what is power building, right? How is that going to expand and grow? And how can we, how is this generation going to influence, everybody else, and the world? So it's really inspiring to see that. Unfortunately, I believe George Jackson wrote something in his book about state repression kind of brings more people into the movement. And so it's sad to have experienced that violence and the contradictions so blatantly on one's body. But I'm hopeful and inspired for, what is to come. And at our campus, like our kids just don't stop. Like they're just out there all the time. So it's really inspiring. So yeah.
Yeah, I think I want to piggyback off of what Sam and Michaela both said, because I think that this moment has brought a lot of grief for students, for undergrads. I mean, even people like myself who, I thought I knew the nature of the university, but I think there's one thing to like know it, and I guess there's one thing to feel it and experience it. Right? Like like hearing that Gene Block watched everything that happened on April 30th with the mob attack, like from the balcony of Royce Hall. Like it feels like some like super villain type stuff, right? And I think it's been a very clarifying moment, I think, for a lot of people. I know, in the days after the attack happened and then the police raid, some black students had like a town hall sort of debriefing space. And yeah, there was just a lot of grief, right? I think the university really took off its mask. And I think that it's scary for people to see. For people who, especially a university like UCLA, the UC system really positions itself as this really liberal place. Um, and I think it's exposed itself as what liberalism is and what it represents, right? In the sort of coded language around free speech and diversity, equity, inclusion, up until a certain extent, right? Up until you challenge power in a meaningful way. And so I think there's been a lot of grief in people realizing what the university is, what liberalism is. I think it's been especially tough for Black students at UCLA because we got our first Black Resource Center in 2020 after George Floyd passed. And I think a lot of students who are at UCLA now weren't there during that struggle for the Black Resource Center and how much pushback we got from administration, right? And I say that to say that I think a lot of people have kind of been, for lack of a better term, like fooled into believing its benevolence. And I think that's cooled off a lot of, movements, a lot of, just kind of demobilize folks. And so I think this has brought back more clarity. And I think it's helping people understand like the university cannot really be a vehicle for our collective liberation, no matter what, the rhetoric it espouses, it's still in its true nature, right? This tool for imperialism, for what bell hooks calls like the white supremacist cis heteropatriarchy. I think I missed imperialism in there. But yeah, so I think it's important to capitalize on this moment as a moment for political education, like Michaela also said. And I think something that I've been thinking about a lot and trying to write something on this is, that one, it's clear that the university will not divest, right, without force, without it being forced, right? So, but what does it mean to also consider the fact that the university or divestment itself is a sort of reform, right? And the divestment still leaves the university intact as it is, and it still leaves it as a sort of imperialist university. So what does that mean for us? How do we go beyond divestment? Absolutely, the university needs to divest, but it's still intertwined in this sort of web of systems and institutions that are trying to kill us. So what does it mean to go further than that, and think about school abolition, like David Stovall talks about, a lot of folks are beginning to talk about university abolition. How do we understand the fact that divestment isn't enough, and what does that mean for our demands, for how we go about achieving our demands? Do we abandon the sort of legal, official policy channels and pursue something more? And I think we're seeing that a lot now, in sort of autonomous, independent actions. At Berkeley, folks have been setting fire to police cars and to sort of retaliate against the university for its use of police violence. Um, so yeah, I think it's important to kind of consider what it means that the university will not divest, and what does it mean it's sort of placed in this sort of web of institutions that are violent and white supremacists and all these things. How do we move forward?
Well, I'm gonna, I guess, build off what they all said earlier, and I want to say, like, 4 years ago, I was like starting college. I was so excited, thought like, university, or like I'm gonna start learning, and like, for future, I'm gonna be, involved in politics and like organize and activism and stuff like that. And so I guess, and especially like here at Pitt, like they always talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice, and like human rights. Especially in school, like classes, at one point I took a human rights class, human rights politics, and like it was really interesting. School have all these resources, but like whenever we actually put it in a practice, they don't like that. Or as long as what they want us to do is just like learn and behave as they want us to. But if we don't, then that's when I guess brutalize the students, and um um it's like it's more, the DEI for them is more like performative, just um for their image, public image, not really um practical. And sorry. um seeing how like the first encampment, the second encampment, how Pitt is like willing to use forces and policing and repression against the student instead of just listening and divesting from um, war and genocide is really disheartening to see here. And I know, it's happening in UCLA and other schools as well. Um, yeah.
Mhm. Yes. Thank you all for that. You all have my my brain is turning really, really fast, and I'm thinking of follow-up questions and looking at the original questions that I sent y'all. Um, but I think something that I'm noticing, a theme that I'm noticing is the way in which someone said, the universe, I think you said it, Gene, the university's mask sort of has come off, right? And what we're actually seeing is that, the co-optation of the language of liberation, diversity, equity, justice, and inclusion are actually like the university functions as like a colonial mechanism, and it actually is sort of central to how we think about epistemology. Like it's the kind of sanctioning um, um, sort of arm of the state that can let the larger public know what a certain term means or what it doesn't mean. Like it has a way of legitimizing language. So justice means one thing. When when the university picks it up, it means another thing, or it just goes away. Like the university will sort of take it, co-opt it toward protecting itself, extending and expanding itself. Um, Gina, I especially appreciate your comments about how it is we should be thinking about the university sort of within the larger structures, within these sort of larger webs and matrices of domination and violence, right? And when we do that, if we centralize violence, then what we actually see, to your point, is the sort of irredeemability of the university. We see the university as a project, a state project, the school as well, right? And so that kind of is transitioning me to a follow-up question that I want to think about with you all. So I've been thinking about the importance of this conversation, particularly the importance of folks here in the U.S. pushing and resisting genocide in Gaza, but also global genocide happening in Haiti, the Congo, Sudan, and other geographies, right? There's a way in which some of the rhetoric that I've heard from administration and faculty members as well is that, that's way over there, we're way over here, and you all should be worried about what's happening here, right? And particularly in the field of education, I think this functions in a specific way where genocide in Gaza is not considered an educational issue, right? So if we are focusing on that, then we're now off task for what it is urban education graduate students are supposed to be doing or studying, or higher education, or teacher education for that matter, right? But I'm thinking about the ways in which schools on the Gaza Strip have been obliterated. So not only is there not learning happening, but the schools were actually sites of attacks, right? Calculated sites of attack. And so I'm thinking about that, and the question arises, well, how is this not an issue of education? Like, how is this not something that we should be learning about and thinking about in the context of higher education? And what I'm recognizing is, coming back to what you said, Gene, like, there's just a way in which the institution doesn't want to teach its students about how its dismantling is necessary, about how its abolition actually has to happen if we're going to be thinking about, again, the fact that they are funding genocide, the fact that they are displacing people, the fact that they have a monopoly on, labor. Thinking about the University of Pittsburgh, UPMC specifically, most of the jobs that folks are getting in the area are within this sort of web. And so I guess my question, or something that I'm wanting you all to think about and engage with me, is, how and why is this particularly an educational issue? And I'm thinking about education broadly. So it could be a specific kind of like subsection, like urban education, higher education, but I'm also thinking about political education, community education, right? Why is the conversation we're having necessary for teaching and learning specifically? Yeah, just wanted to raise that with you all. Is that clear? Okay.
Yeah, I think there's quite a few ways that this is an education issue. I think what's the most glaring and obvious is the fact, like what you said, like all Palestinian universities have been obliterated, right? And when you think about, you know, education is a place for learning, but at a more fundamental level, education is about reproducing society, right? And so what does it mean that Palestinian society, at least in terms of higher education, at this moment does not have any sites for reproduction, right? For teaching the knowledge, for passing knowledge on to the next generation. Of course, education will still happen. Education does not have to happen in the schoolhouse, but what is the symbolism that's there in saying we are going to destroy your way of reproducing your society, right? It's genocidal. But then even, we also have to think about, sorry, I have these loud ass birds outside my window. I hope they're not audible. But I think something else that's important to think about too is, Martin Luther King, when he talks about the three evils, right? And one of them being militarism or, imperialism. And, one of the central things that, that was happening at the time of the Poor People's Movement was the sort of fight against the Vietnam War, right? We're sending all this money for guns, but we don't have any money for butter, right? So what does it mean that we spend half of our federal budget on the military? We spend in the city of LA, we spend half of our budget on the police, but our schools, right, are being forced to shut down. Um, you know, at one of my high schools in LA, the ceiling tiles would fall, right? And that could injure a student, right? So what does it mean that our schools in the cities don't have any money to just function as basic schools, but we send all this money over to places like Israel, to places like Ukraine. And so it absolutely is an educational issue, right? When you think about where your tax dollars are going. And then it's also a moment for political education, for radicalization, for ethnic studies. The birds are so loud. But yeah. So I think that it's a multifaceted educational issue. Absolutely.
I kind of want to pick up where Gene had it at the funding for schools in our areas. Like PPS, the public school system here has like a lot of old buildings, a lot of buildings that recently in this past just before school year was out had to go on heat advisory virtual days, like because there's no AC in these buildings and it's literally going to kill these kids. Um, they're going to be supposedly consolidating some schools within the next years, like combining them and getting rid of buildings. Like we're seeing actively across the board attacks on our education here, and they have specifically ramped up now in regards to Palestine, something that Palestine has really done, and the Palestinians have really done with Al-Aqsa flood, has just been revealing like everything. Everything's been exposed for the Zionism and imperialism that it is, including our education system and like the people who run it. Um, to me, it's because of the fungibility. The university and education in general wants to make fungible the students. So like it can make them non-students, students whenever it wants. It wants to make fungible all of these like academic terms we use. Essentially like it wants to make all the consciousness fungible, move it wherever it wants, change it however it wants, use the bodies however it wants. And like in Palestine, not only have universities been destroyed, archives have been destroyed, heritage sites have been destroyed. Virtually every single UNRWA school, UNRWA school has been attacked or bombed or shelled. And like I've seen videos of teachers still doing small lessons with their kids. And I just want to think about what is that education really if these kids are malnourished, living under bombardment and shelling, constant attacks. Like people here won't even say Palestine. I haven't really heard any administrators say the word Palestine, and like it's as if it doesn't exist. That's not that itself is not an education problem for me. That's like a clear indication that the education system we have now is just broken, was not meant to work. Um, and in that way, it is an education problem. Like we just need a new system because what we have now is producing fungibility, just making everyone a commodity, having them however they want, nothing gets to do anything. And we need one where people are taught political education, they're prepared for analysis of the world, where they can look at Palestine and see schools here don't have money, but Israeli settlers get free healthcare, they get a bunch of free, subsidized goods from the markets, while Palestinians, right over the border where they're having a rave, are held in a concentration camp. Like, what all of this has been showing us is like education is central to all of this reproduction, because in Israeli society, those kids are like literally taught that Arabs have a history or Muslims have a history of like religious struggle against Jews, that there's been a constant war over that land. They do military training camps with the kids. There's literally textbooks that they've ripped out of Palestinian students' hands and replaced with different textbooks. Like, the fact that I have teachers who like could see that, and then also see that in our classrooms, I'm using the same middle school history textbook I used when I was in middle school. So like 10, 15 years old, and absolutely horrendous at teaching people. Like, people are so alienated and disconnected from things by being made into like replaceable, fungible commodities that it's they just don't even want to see it as an education issue, because I think deep down it makes people feel mad. It makes them feel like they've been lied to. It makes them feel like they don't understand, and that all of this is like someone else's fault outside of their power. And to be honest, a part of it is like we have all been lied to. We have been indoctrinated into Zionism and imperialism to a certain extent to accept our conditions of unfreedom here and the conditions of unfreedom elsewhere, just for the material convenience of our lives. Just for like, we get to have the university, Palestinians don't. We get to have archives, they don't. And yet we still can't even really do anything with ours. It's just full of contradictions that kind of abound and astound me a lot.
Yeah, I wanted to echo what Sam was saying and also what Jean was saying. I think I want to speak on like the importance of teaching about the genocide, not only in Palestine, but in all other geographies and around the world, and also like the legacy of the US empire that's really been, dominant over the past, 200 years. But I also think the importance of teaching it specifically for drawing the parallels between literally what's happening in the US and what's happening in Gaza, right? And I think that's really a reason why it's not being taught and people are ignoring it, people are pushing it to the side, people don't want to embrace it. It's because it's really a mirror to some extent of what's happening right now and what's been happening in the US to Black, Brown, marginalized people. And so I think when we take the time to really study and to look at Palestine and to look at either all the other genocides that the US has had hands in, it's really like a reflection and a mirror of ourselves. And that's absolutely what the US does not want, right? The state does not want us to investigate ourselves, to learn our history, to learn how we've been oppressed, and how we can also look at, I think, another aspect too. And I'm thinking about this in the context of power building, doing education with community, right? What would happen if we are working with houseless folks, which my org does? We're learning about Palestine together and they're drawing the parallels, right? What's going to happen when we all come together and we build power in that way? But I also really want to emphasize too that I don't think a lot of people do is the resistance that's happening in Palestine, right? People don't want to actually look at how people are fighting back and how resistance it's not US, where our camps are not doing anything, right? Our camps are making little names for themselves, but the resistance movement is really, Palestine's going to free itself. And I always want to emphasize that. But that's also what people don't want to talk about or look at, is the resistance that is needed and that is taking place. And that's been taking place for, hundreds of years. And so how can we learn about that? How can we learn about the attacks of the Zionist entity on Palestine? I read this article that was describing the way the Zionist entity attacks all six senses of Palestine people and their ears, their nose, their everything, right? And so what is that? What are the same tactics that they're literally training, like the LAPD that literally came and fought us, right? Like a few weeks ago. And so what are these parallels? Like the Stop Cop City, the cop cities that people are trying to build around the US that are literally coming from Israel, right? From the Zionist military project. And so I think that's the importance, right, of teaching that. And not only teaching that in the university, which I have been lucky enough to have a few professors that have actually wanted to take the time to learn about, to teach us about it and to talk about it. But that's one of, thousands, right, that are in the education system. So how can we find this information? How can we teach and learn about it? Maybe it doesn't take place in the university, right? Maybe like what Jean was saying, after we, burn down all the universities and we build our own universities, what's going to happen? How are we going to learn this? How are we going to inform our people about this? And so I think it's really important to learn about it. And just the education that's needed, right? That the state does not want us to have. They don't want us to have the weapons that is in our minds, right? So yeah, I wanted to emphasize the need to study not only in the university but outside as well.
Thank you so much. And Elyanna, we are just about at time, so I will leave the last word to you to close us out.
Well, I'm gonna echo what Dev's mentioned earlier, and also what I agree with Sam. Education is really important about, we need to like educate about what's happening in Gaza, and that's, what similar to what Michaela said is, the similarity between the struggle and the oppression that's happening in Gaza or in Palestine in general as well is similar to what's happening in the US in the Black and Brown community here. In university here, they don't really teach about the struggles of Black and Brown communities as much. And they've always, I guess not only in the US, but also outside, like what's happening in, Sudan or in Africa. There's not much education or any classes around, these topics. But, 2 years ago when the war in Ukraine happened, which I really appreciate how, many professors and faculty have done like panels and teaching and other things in the university. That was really impressive. But also I didn't see that when, with what's happening in Iran last year, with what's happening in Palestine this year. I've never seen that with what's happening, during Black Lives Matters and, all these issues. And this is only, going back, I guess, to, that's more about the brown community always being oppressed, and it's like, they're normalizing the struggle or oppression. It's as if it's like, doesn't really matter, like we're always oppressed. There's no need to I don't know. So I think, yeah.
Yes, and I'll close us out with a short word just to say I appreciate that we're ending this conversation on the importance of study, on the importance of education. And I just want to say, I think that what it means to educate the masses, especially masses of oppressed peoples, of colonized peoples, to continue to teach the fact that if you are oppressed, if your people or your land is occupied, you have the right to defend, you have the right to resist, you have the right to liberate yourself from oppression, period. And I think that I raised the education question because when in the field especially, but in sort of traditional structures more broadly, we think about education as a type of vehicle for economic transformation, right? We think about specific subjects, we think about specific expertises, but we don't think about what it actually means for people to learn about what it means to be oppressed and to learn about who and how these oppressed peoples have liberated themselves, and why that's been important. And so when I think about political education, radical education, wherever it may happen, I just appreciate being in conversation with y'all so that we can continue to push that forward and continue to teach that oppressed peoples have like a God-given right to liberate themselves. So I'm going to close this out there. I want to thank each of you again so much for this conversation. This was excellent. I have a bunch of notes. I hope that everyone who is here enjoyed it and was able to take something from it. For the people who are on the webinar, if I could ask you to hold for just a second. Our CUE administrator, Emily, has a few messages about the upcoming sessions, but that will conclude this session on university encampment. So thanks again to Sam, Michaela, Jean, and Elyanna so much. I appreciate y'all.
Thank you for the invite. It's great being here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Free Palestine, y'all.